Okay, welcome to my part two of my 2.3 fatigue and recovery presentation. So the recovery, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption or EPOC. What is this? What does EPOC mean? It means excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. As you can see in the graph, there are three main stages: resting O2 consumption, steady state O2 consumption, and lastly the EPOC. From the graph above, you can see that when we start exercise at the start, there is something called the O2 deficit. This is a temporary shortage of oxygen during exercise. This means that when we first start exercise, we cannot instantly use our aerobic system, so we use the anaerobic for a few minutes. Anaerobic, of course, means that we do not use oxygen, so this is where the lack of oxygen comes in. In the middle of the graph, you can see that the line plateaus, and this is because this is a submaximal graph, and therefore we eventually reach a steady state, which is where the flat line is. The reason that the line in this EPOC graph is straight is because our body is able to work efficiently with the amount of oxygen that is being supplied, and there is no deficit, which means there is no oxygen that is needing to be used. The final stage of this graph is the epoch. This is where we have stopped exercise and are now in recovery. The epoch is the amount of oxygen that is needed in order to resupply our muscle phosphates, phosphages, and the ATP-PC system. So now on to the fast components. This is the ATP-PC, myoglobin, and hemoglobin. So what are the fast components? During EPOC, it needs two things called alactic fast recovery and lactic slow recovery. During the fast recovery, the ATP-PC system is resynthesized, and the hemoglobin and myoglobin are restocked. The way in which the ATP-PC is that it takes 3 to 4 litres of oxygen to resynthesize the ATP. This process takes about 3 minutes for a 100% recovery. The way in which the oxyhemoglobin and the hemoglobin are refilled is after exercise. When we are still breathing, the oxygen is coming in, and because the muscles are not working anymore, the oxyhemoglobin and hemoglobin supplies are able to restore as they're not being used anymore, so they're restored with the oxygen, and therefore eventually all of these are refueled. Another fast component that happens in the removal of lactic acid. This happens after exercise. The reason for this is when lactic acid is produced, it goes into the bloodstream, and because we are exercising, it is constantly going into the blood. However, when we have stopped exercising, the blood continues to flow, of course, and because the lactic acid is not flowing into the blood anymore, the blood just takes it away, where it is absorbed by the kidneys and is taken out of the bloodstream. Once this happens, the bloodstream is now clean of lactic acid. So moving on to the slow components. The removal of CO2, lactic acid, and replenishment of glycogen stores. The three factors that are shown above are what makes it harder to recover from exercise. The way in which the removal of CO2 slows down recovery is that the body has to get it out of our system, which takes time. 70% of the CO2 is carried in the plasma in the capillaries, where it diffuses into the alveoli, and from here is exhaled into the environment. 23% of the CO2 is carried by oxaminohemoglobin, which also goes to the lungs, where it diffuses into the alveoli. The other 37% of it is dissolved into the plasma, where it also goes to the alveoli and is diffused there. The reason this slows down our recovery is because we have to keep breathing more, even though we have finished exercise, in order to keep getting the CO2 out of our system. Otherwise, it is left inside our bloodstream, which increases the blood acidity, which we do not want as we are trying to recover. The lactic acid during slow recovery is also split up into percentage, where 65% of the acid is converted to pyruvate in the process called anaerobic glycolysis. 5% of the lactic acid is converted to glucose, where it is used during the Cori cycle in the liver. 20% of it is converted to glycogen, where it is also used in the Cori cycle and is stored in the muscles and also the liver. And the last 10% of it is converted into protein. The Cori cycle is where pyruvate is changed into glucose through glyconeogenesis, where it then goes from the liver into the muscles, where it is then turns back into pyruvate through anaerobic glycolysis, and then the lactate process starts over again. The glycogen stores can take up to 48 hours to actually be restored. When you do something that is short duration and high intensity, such as 800-meter sprint, it can take up to just 2 hours to restore the glycogen from this exercise. However, it is when you start doing something such as a marathon, which is long duration and low intensity exercise, is the aerobic restoration can take up to 2 days. If you have a high carb diet, this means the recovery process can increase the recovery and speed. In order to have increased recovery rate, you would have to consume 300 to 400 calories of carbs straight after training sessions, and then the same amount again within a couple of hours after the exercise. An example of how you can get them in quickly after exercise are the high carb loaded drinks which you can take immediately after exercise, that they sometimes even give out to people when you finish marathons. Some studies have suggested that combining carbs and protein together gave a faster, more effective recovery than just carbs alone at raising muscle glycogen after aerobic exercise. Now we're going to the active cool down and the skeletal muscle pump. After exercise, the occurrence of delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS, can happen to you. This is where you experience post-exercise pain and aching. And the reason for this is that the blood pH is being sensed by the pain receptors, which will send an impulse to the central nervous system, and then we will feel the pain. You can do something called an active recovery, which helps the muscles that were active to be flooded with oxygenated blood, which reduces the lactic acid effects inside the muscles and therefore speeds up recovery. When doing an active cool down, the skeletal muscle pump is used. The way in which it is used is because the skeletal muscles are still contracting because we are moving, the oxygenated blood is still being circulated around the body, which means the muscles are constantly being resupplied with oxygen at a high rate, because the skeletal muscles are helping the blood get there, and this will speed up recovery because the muscles are getting really good supply of amount of oxygen even after the exercise is finished. The constant circulation of blood also helps get rid of CO2 and lactic acid quicker than when at rest as well, which of course also speeds up the recovery. Okay, that was my 2.3 fatigue and recovery PowerPoint. Thank you for watching.